Jack Miller saved a boy from fire. Hours later, the district attorney who helped convict him a decade ago watched the news footage with trembling hands. The quiet man pulled the boy from the burning car. Hours later, the DA found he was framed, is the story of how one moment of raw courage unraveled 10 years of carefully constructed lies. A mechanic wrongfully imprisoned, a prosecutor who never questioned the evidence, a child who lived because someone convicted of violence chose mercy instead. This is where heroism collides with betrayal, and the truth finally demands its reckoning. Subscribe to witness justice crawl from the ashes. The smoke curled upward into the Denver twilight like the fingers of something dying, thick and black against the amber glow of streetlights that had just begun to flicker on. Jack Miller stood on the sidewalk with his hands still trembling, the skin on his knuckles split open where the metal of the car door had bitten into flesh. The smell of burning rubber and something worse, something organic and terrible, clinging to his clothes and hair. He watched the paramedics lift the small body onto the stretcher, the boy's face smudged with soot and streaked with tears, his chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate gasps that reminded Jack of a bird he'd once found trapped in his garage, beating itself against the walls until exhaustion took over. The crowd had gathered in that way crowds do, a semicircle of strangers united by horror and curiosity, their phones raised like offerings to some digital god, capturing every angle of suffering for consumption later. Jack felt their eyes on him, heard the murmurs of hero and brave floating through the evening air, but the words felt foreign, like a language he'd once known but had forgotten how to speak. The fire trucks had arrived 7 minutes after the initial explosion, though to Jack it had felt like hours, like time itself had warped and stretched in the heat. He had been walking home from the garage where he worked, his hands still greasy from an afternoon spent beneath the hood of a '98 Chevy, his mind occupied with the mundane calculus of bills and rent and whether he had enough milk for morning coffee. Then came the sound, a metallic shriek, followed by the deep, guttural roar of ignition, and suddenly the silver sedan 20 feet ahead had transformed into a cage of flame. He had run without thinking, without the careful deliberation that marked most of his movements these days. The caution of a man who had learned that the world punishes spontaneity. The driver's side door had already been blown outward from the force of whatever had detonated in the engine, but the back door where the boy was strapped remained closed, the child's safety locks engaged, trapping the 6-year-old inside with the smoke and heat and the terror of not understanding why the world was suddenly trying to devour him. Jack's hands had found the door handle, the metal already hot enough to brand, and he'd pulled with everything he had, the tendons in his shoulders screaming protest until something gave way. Whether the lock or the frame itself, he couldn't say. The boy had been screaming, a high-pitched wail that cut through the roar of flames, and Jack had reached in, his arms engulfed in smoke that made his eyes stream and his lungs seize, feeling blindly until his fingers closed around small shoulders. He'd pulled the child free just as the fuel tank caught, the secondary explosion sending a wave of heat that knocked them both to the pavement, Jack's body covering the boys as debris rained down around them. In that moment, pressed against cold concrete, with a stranger's child sobbing beneath him, Jack Miller felt something he hadn't felt in 10 years. A sense of purpose that didn't involve simply surviving until tomorrow. But even as the boy's heartbeat pounded against his chest, even as the sirens grew louder and help finally arrived, there was a part of Jack that remained cold, untouched by the warmth of heroism, the part that knew better than to trust the world's sudden approval. Now, standing apart from the crowd as the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, with lights spinning red and blue against the smoke-darkened sky, Jack felt the adrenaline beginning to drain from his system, leaving behind the familiar heaviness that was his constant companion. A police officer approached him, young and earnest. her uniform still crisp despite the chaos, and she asked him questions in that carefully neutral tone they all learned at the academy. His name, his address, what he'd seen before the explosion. Jack answered in the same flat voice he'd cultivated over years of parole hearings and mandatory check-ins, providing information without elaboration, facts stripped of emotion or interpretation. She thanked him, called him brave, said the boy's parents would want to meet him to express their gratitude, and Jack nodded without committing to anything, already feeling the weight of attention that he'd spent a decade trying to avoid. The officer handed him a card with a case number, told him someone might follow up for an official statement, and then she was gone, pulled away by the demands of securing the scene and managing the crowd that was slowly beginning to disperse now that the immediate drama had passed. Jack walked away as the firefighters continued their work, drowning the burning vehicle in foam that hissed and steamed against hot metal, the acrid smell mixing with the evening air that had grown cold now that the sun had fully set. His apartment was 6 blocks away, a one-bedroom above a laundromat that smelled perpetually of fabric softener and industrial detergent, and he walked with his head down, hands shoved into pockets despite the pain in his knuckles, trying to become invisible again. He passed storefronts with flickering neon signs, a bodega where the owner nodded to him in recognition, a bus stop where 3 teenagers shared a cigarette and barely glanced in his direction. This was his world now, these 6 square blocks of Denver's industrial district where nobody asked too many questions and nobody expected anything more than punctuality and competence from the men who worked with their hands and kept to themselves. He had built this small, careful life after his release, brick by brick, choosing isolation over the complications of connection, choosing silence over the risk of being truly seen. But as he climbed the narrow stairs to his apartment, the wood creaking beneath his boots, Jack knew that something had shifted. The boy's face would stay with him, those wide eyes reflecting flames, the way his small hands had clutched at Jack's shirt as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become liquid and dangerous. And somewhere in the back of his mind, in the place where old wounds lived and festered, Jack felt the first tremor of a truth he'd spent 10 years trying to bury. That one act of courage, performed without thought or calculation, might have consequences far beyond the life he'd saved. The key turned in the lock. The door swung open to reveal his sparse living room with its second-hand furniture and bare walls, and Jack stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a finality that felt less like security and more like denial. He had saved a boy from fire, and in doing so, he had stepped back into the light, and the light, he knew from bitter experience, revealed everything. Whether you wanted it to or not, Laura Hayes sat in her office on the 8th floor of the Denver District Attorney's Building. The city spread out below her windows like a circuit board of lights and movement, and watched the late news on her laptop, with a coffee cup going cold in her hand. The footage was raw, pulled from someone's cell phone, shaky and overexposed, but clear enough to show the figure of a man pulling a child from a burning vehicle, clear enough to capture the moment when heroism and desperation became indistinguishable. The reporter's voice provided context over the images. A 6-year-old boy rescued from a car fire on 32nd Street, his rescuer identified as Jack Miller, 39, a local mechanic who had acted without hesitation. Laura's hand froze halfway to her mouth, the coffee cup suspended in air as her mind worked backward through the years, searching the catalogue of names and faces that populated her professional memory. Jack Miller. She knew that name, knew it in the way you know the taste of something bitter that you once had to swallow. Her office was silent, except for the hum of the heating system and the distant sound of traffic 8 floors below. But inside her head, there was a sudden cacophony of voices, witnesses, defense attorneys, her own younger self arguing points of law with the confidence of someone who had never yet made a mistake that mattered. Jack Miller had been convicted 11 years ago of armed robbery. A convenience store on the east side where the clerk had been beaten badly enough to require reconstructive surgery. Laura hadn't tried the case herself. She'd been a junior prosecutor then, 3 years out of law school and hungry to prove herself. But she'd been part of the team that had prepared the evidence, that had reviewed the police reports and witness statements and the physical evidence that had seemed at the time overwhelmingly conclusive. There had been security footage, grainy but serviceable, showing a man of Miller's approximate height and build. There had been the victim's identification, hesitant at first, but growing more certain with each subsequent interview. And there had been the gun, recovered from Miller's apartment during a search authorized by a warrant that Laura herself had helped draft. She set the coffee cup down with a hand that had begun to shake, pulled up the case file from the archives, and began to read with the focus of someone searching for cracks in a foundation they'd once helped build. The conviction had been clean, or so it had seemed. Miller had maintained his innocence throughout, but they all did, and the evidence had told a different story. He'd served 9 years of a 15-year sentence before being released on parole, and then he'd disappeared into the kind of quiet existence that made parole officers happy and prosecutors forget. But now here he was, pulling a child from fire, and something about the juxtaposition felt wrong to Laura in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. She had spent 15 years in the district attorney's office, had risen through the ranks on the strength of her conviction rate and her ability to construct narratives that juries found compelling, but she had also learned to trust the instinct that whispered when something didn't fit. When the edges of a story were too smooth, too convenient, the case file revealed details she'd forgotten or never fully absorbed. Miller's complete lack of prior criminal history, his insistence that he'd been working a double shift at the garage the night of the robbery, his employer's testimony that had been undermined on cross-examination by questions about the reliability of the time cards and the possibility of clocking in and then leaving. The defense had been competent but not inspired, constrained by a public defender's caseload and the weight of physical evidence that seemed irrefutable. Laura read through the trial transcripts with the benefit of hindsight, seeing now what she should have seen then, the way the victim's certainty had grown with each pre-trial interview, the way the security footage, when examined frame by frame, showed a figure whose features were obscured enough to allow for interpretation rather than identification. And the gun, recovered from Miller's apartment in a location that seemed almost calculated to be discovered, tucked beneath the mattress in a way that felt more like staging than concealment. She leaned back in her chair as the city lights blurred beyond the window, her mind constructing and deconstructing scenarios with the methodical precision that had made her good at this job. If Jack Miller had been innocent, and she allowed herself to consider the possibility now in a way she never had before, then someone had gone to considerable effort to ensure his conviction. The evidence hadn't materialized by accident. It had been placed, cultivated, shaped into a narrative that a jury had found compelling enough to send a man to prison for 15 years. Laura felt something cold settling in her chest. Not quite guilt, but its precursor, the awareness that she had been part of a mechanism that might have ground an innocent life into acceptable collateral. She had reviewed that warrant application, had found it sufficient, had never questioned whether the anonymous tip that had led police to Miller's apartment might have been anything other than a concerned citizen doing their civic duty. The footage of the rescue played again on her screen, this muted repetition of heroism that had been shared thousands of times across social media in the hours since it happened. Laura watched Jack Miller pull the boy from the flames, watched him cover the child's body with his own as the second explosion sent debris into the air, and she saw in that action something that contradicted the narrative she'd helped construct 11 years ago. The man in that video moved without hesitation toward danger, put himself between a child and death without apparent regard for his own safety, and Laura had spent enough time in courtrooms to know that character, while not destiny, left traces that were hard to fake. She had prosecuted violent men, had looked into eyes that held nothing but calculation and self-interest, and something about that security footage from 11 years ago now struck her as wrong in a way that made her hands tighten around the edge of her desk. She had been so certain then, so confident in the rightness of her role in the machinery of justice. But certainty, she was learning, was sometimes just another word for blindness. Laura Hayes closed the case file, opened a new document on her computer, and began to type a memo that would start the process of reopening a case that everyone else had long since forgotten. Outside her window, Denver continued its evening rhythm, indifferent to the quiet unraveling beginning 8 floors above its streets. The conference room on the 9th floor held the stale air of a space used only for difficult conversations, its walls decorated with photographs of former district attorneys whose stern expressions seemed to judge the living from frames gone slightly dusty with neglect. Laura Hayes sat at the head of the long table with her memo printed and organized into neat stacks, facing 3 colleagues whose skepticism was evident in the angle of their shoulders and the careful neutrality of their expressions. Marcus Webb, the senior prosecutor who had actually tried the Miller case, sat directly across from her with his arms crossed, his tie loosened at the collar in a way that suggested he'd been pulled from more important work. To his left was Patricia Chen, the office's chief investigator, whose role required her to question everything but whose loyalty to past convictions ran deep. And to Laura's right sat David Kimmel, the deputy district attorney, whose political instincts made him cautious about anything that might suggest the office had made mistakes, especially mistakes that had resulted in a man spending 9 years in prison. Laura began by laying out the facts without editorial comment, the way she'd learned to present information to judges who valued precision over passion. Jack Miller had been convicted of armed robbery and aggravated assault based on eyewitness identification, security footage, and physical evidence recovered from his residence. He had served 9 years before being paroled, had maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration, and had recently made headlines by rescuing a child from a burning vehicle. She distributed copies of the original case file, highlighting sections she'd marked in yellow. Inconsistencies in the victim's initial description versus his later certainty, the convenient timing of an anonymous tip that led directly to the recovery of the weapon, the absence of fingerprints on the gun despite it allegedly being used in a crime just hours before its discovery. She watched their faces as they read, saw Marcus's jaw tighten and Patricia's eyes narrow in the way that meant her investigator's mind was already working through possibilities she didn't want to consider. Marcus spoke first, his voice carrying the defensive edge of a man whose professional reputation was being called into question by implication. He reminded the room that the case had been solid, that a jury of Miller's peers had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict, that the defense had been given every opportunity to present alternative theories and had failed to convince anyone. The security footage, while not high definition, had been clear enough that 3 independent analysts had confirmed the figure's general physical characteristics matched Miller. The victim had been certain, had picked Miller out of a lineup without hesitation, had testified with conviction that this was the man who had beaten him badly enough to break his orbital bone and shatter his confidence in the basic safety of going to work. And the gun, Marcus emphasized this point by tapping the table with his index finger, had been found in Miller's apartment, not planted on some street corner or left in an obvious location, but hidden in a way that suggested ownership and consciousness of guilt. Laura let him finish before responding, keeping her tone measured and professional despite the frustration building behind her sternum. She wasn't suggesting that Marcus had done anything wrong, she said, only that they had an obligation to examine new information when it presented itself. And Miller's recent actions suggested a character inconsistent with the crime for which he'd been convicted. She directed their attention to the timeline reconstruction she'd prepared, showing that Miller's employer had testified to his presence at the garage during the hours in question, testimony that had been dismissed because the time card system had been shown to be unreliable. But, Laura pointed out, if they looked at the totality of circumstantial evidence rather than focusing solely on the physical evidence, a different picture emerged. A man with no criminal history, with a documented work ethic, with no apparent motive for a robbery that had netted less than $300 and resulted in a level of violence that seemed inconsistent with someone acting out of financial desperation. Patricia Chen leaned forward, her elbows on the table, and her fingers steepled beneath her chin, and asked the question that Laura had been waiting for. What, specifically, did Laura think had happened if Miller hadn't committed the robbery? Laura took a breath before answering, knowing that once she spoke the words aloud, she would be committing herself to a path that would require more than late nights and good intentions. She believed, she said carefully, that the physical evidence had been planted, that someone with knowledge of police procedure and access to Miller's residence had staged the discovery in a way calculated to secure a conviction. The anonymous tip had come from an untraceable burner phone. The gun had been found in a location obvious enough to be discovered during a standard search, but not so obvious as to raise immediate suspicion of planting. And the victim's growing certainty about his identification had followed a pattern consistent with suggestion rather than genuine recognition. His initial description vague enough to apply to thousands of men before crystallizing around Miller's specific features after being shown photographs. David Kimmel, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke in the careful language of political calculation. He acknowledged Laura's concerns, praised her diligence in reviewing the case, and then outlined the practical realities of what she was proposing. Reopening a conviction meant admitting the possibility of error, which would invite scrutiny not just of this case, but of others from the same period, the same investigators, the same prosecutors. It would require resources that were already stretched thin, would generate negative press regardless of the outcome, and would set a precedent that could encourage other convicted individuals to seek review of their cases based on nothing more than subsequent good behavior. He wasn't saying no, he emphasized, but he needed Laura to understand what she was asking for, and to be certain that the evidence justified the disruption. His eyes held hers across the table with an intensity that communicated more than his words. This would have consequences for her career, for her standing in an office where loyalty and judgment were equally valued, and she needed to be sure before setting this in motion. Laura gathered her papers as the meeting ended without resolution, Marcus departing with barely concealed irritation, and Patricia promising to review the case file more carefully before making any recommendations. She stood alone in the conference room for a moment after they'd left, looking out at the city where Jack Miller was presumably going about his day, unaware that the machinery of justice was slowly, reluctantly, beginning to turn in his direction. She thought about the boy he'd saved, about the parents who had their child back because a man convicted of violence had chosen to risk his life for a stranger. She thought about the 9 years Miller had spent in prison, about the way incarceration changed people, about the particular kind of damage that came from being punished for something you didn't do. And she thought about herself at 28, eager and certain, and so focused on building a case that she'd never stopped to question whether the case should be built at all. Laura Hayes picked up her files, turned off the lights, and left the conference room with the uncomfortable awareness that justice, when it finally arrived, was often too late to undo the harm that had been done in its absence. But late, she told herself as she walked back to her office, was still better than never. Patricia Chen spent 3 days in the evidence archive, a basement facility that smelled of concrete and aging paper, surrounded by boxes that contained the material remnants of crimes committed and adjudicated years or decades before. She worked methodically through the Miller case evidence, photographing everything, taking notes in the precise shorthand she'd developed over 20 years of investigation, looking for the discrepancies that time and careful examination might reveal. The gun was logged in, its chain of custody documented with the thoroughness required by protocol. But Patricia noticed something on her second review that she'd missed initially. The evidence tag showed it had been checked out once, 3 days before trial, by a detective named Raymond Carver, who had since retired from the Denver Police Department. The checkout was legitimate, authorized by the lead prosecutor for the purpose of forensic re-examination, but the timing struck Patricia as unusual, given that all forensic work had been completed months earlier during the initial investigation. She cross-referenced the checkout against the trial schedule and found that the re-examination had been requested after the defense had filed a motion to suppress the weapon based on questions about the warrant's validity. The forensic report filed after that checkout had confirmed that the gun was indeed the weapon used in the robbery, matching the ballistic evidence recovered at the scene, and had noted the absence of fingerprints with the explanation that the weapon had been wiped clean. Patricia sat back in her chair, surrounded by evidence boxes and the fluorescent hum of basement lighting, and allowed herself to think thoughts that would have consequences if spoken aloud. A weapon without fingerprints suggested either extraordinary caution by the perpetrator or a level of preparation that bordered on professional. And a checkout 3 days before trial, ostensibly for re-examination, provided a window of opportunity for someone with the right access and the wrong intentions to ensure that the evidence would survive scrutiny. She drafted an email to Laura with her findings, keeping the language neutral and factual, suggesting that they might want to locate Raymond Carver and ask him about the circumstances surrounding that evidence checkout. But before sending it, Patricia decided to dig deeper into Carver's background, using the law enforcement databases that remained accessible to her through professional courtesy and shared credentials. What she found complicated the narrative in ways that made her stomach tighten with the recognition of patterns she'd seen before, in cases that had ended careers. Carver had been investigated twice by Internal Affairs, once for excessive force and once for allegations of evidence tampering in an unrelated case, though both investigations had concluded without disciplinary action. He had retired with full benefits 3 years ago, citing health issues, and had moved to a property in rural Montana that public records showed he'd purchased for cash, $600,000. Significantly more than a detective's pension and savings should have allowed, unless there were other sources of income not reflected in his tax returns. Laura received Patricia's email at 11 at night, read it 3 times while sitting in bed with her laptop balanced on her knees, and felt the case shift from theoretical concerns about justice to something more concrete and dangerous. Evidence tampering, if that's what had occurred, wasn't just a mistake or an oversight. It was a deliberate act of corruption that had stolen 9 years of Jack Miller's life and had likely been motivated by something beyond simple professional ambition. She wrote back to Patricia, asking her to find out everything she could about Raymond Carver's finances in the years following Miller's conviction, about any connections he might have had to the victim or the crime scene, about whether there had been other cases from that period where evidence had been questioned and Carver had been involved. And then, Because it was late and she was alone with thoughts that felt too heavy to carry by herself, Laura drafted a message to Jack Miller's parole officer, requesting a meeting to discuss his current status and whether there were any concerns about his reintegration into society, knowing that this was just pretext for what she really wanted, a chance to look Jack Miller in the eye and see if the man matched the hero from the video or the criminal from the case file. 2 days later, Laura sat across from Raymond Carver in a coffee shop in Whitefish, Montana, having driven 8 hours through mountain passes that were already showing signs of early snow, her rental car struggling with altitude, and her mind occupied with the questions she needed to ask without revealing the full extent of what she suspected. Carver was 62, grey-haired and thick through the middle, his face carrying the weathered look of someone who spent significant time outdoors. He'd agreed to meet her with a casual friendliness that seemed genuine, ordering a black coffee and a cinnamon roll before asking what had brought her all the way from Denver to talk about a case that was more than a decade old. Laura explained that they were conducting a routine review of convictions from that period, part of a new initiative to ensure the integrity of their evidence procedures, and she had a few questions about the Miller case since his name appeared in the chain of custody documentation. Carver nodded, sipped his coffee, and talked about the case with the ease of someone recounting a story they'd told many times before. He remembered Miller's conviction, remembered thinking at the time that the guy had seemed like an unlikely criminal, but that the evidence had been solid enough to overcome any doubts. He confirmed that he'd checked out the weapon for re-examination before trial, explained that the prosecutor had wanted to be absolutely certain the forensics would hold up under cross-examination given the defense's motion to suppress. He'd taken it to the lab himself, had waited while they ran the tests again, had logged it back in with all the proper documentation. Nothing unusual, he said. Just standard procedure when a case had high stakes and a defense attorney who was making noise about constitutional violations. Laura watched his face as he spoke, looking for the tells that years of deposing witnesses had taught her to recognize. The slight dilation of pupils that accompanied lying, the shift in posture that suggested discomfort, the verbal fillers that bought time to construct a narrative. But Carver seemed relaxed, almost bored by questions about a case that to him was just one of hundreds he'd worked during his career. It wasn't until Laura asked about his retirement, about whether he'd found Montana to be a good place to settle after decades in law enforcement, that she saw the first crack in his composure, a momentary tightening around his eyes, a pause that lasted half a second too long before he answered. He'd been lucky, he said, to inherit some money from an uncle who'd made smart investments in tech stocks before the boom, and he'd always loved the mountains, so when health issues made it clear that police work was becoming physically demanding, he'd taken the opportunity to start the next chapter. Laura let the lies sit between them for a moment, let him see in her silence that she'd noted the implausibility of the explanation before thanking him for his time and standing to leave. She paused at the door, turned back as if something had just occurred to her, and asked one final question. Had there been anyone else who'd shown particular interest in the Miller case at the time? Anyone who'd been following the investigation more closely than professional duty required? Carver's face went carefully blank, the cop mask sliding into place as he recognized that the conversation had never been routine. That Laura Hayes had driven 8 hours not to confirm procedures, but to ask questions that had real implications. He said he didn't recall anyone showing unusual interest, that it had been a standard robbery case that had gotten solved because of good police work and a citizen who'd been willing to come forward with information. Laura nodded, left her card on the table with an invitation to call if he remembered anything else, and walked out into the Montana afternoon with the certainty that Raymond Carver knew exactly what had happened to Jack Miller, and that whatever truth he carried was buried beneath layers of self-preservation that would require more than polite questions to excavate. She drove back to Denver through the gathering dusk, her mind constructing theories and discarding them, knowing that proof would require more than suspicion, and that the deeper she dug, the more people would have reason to want her to stop. But she also knew, with the clarity that sometimes comes late in professional life, that she had participated in an injustice, and that participation carried obligations that couldn't be satisfied by simply moving on to the next case. Jack Miller had saved a child from fire, had given years of his life to a prison cell for a crime he hadn't committed, and Laura Hayes was going to find out who had put him there and why, regardless of where the investigation led or what it cost her to see it through. Jack Miller's hands moved through the familiar ritual of an oil change with the automatic precision of someone who'd performed the task thousands of times, his mind elsewhere as his body completed the sequence. Drain plug removal, filter replacement, new oil measured and poured with the exactness that engines required. The garage where he worked occupied a corner lot in the industrial district. Its bay doors opened to the October air that carried the first real chill of approaching winter and the smell of leaf smoke from somewhere beyond the chain-link fence that bordered the property. His boss, Eddie Morales, ran the shop with the relaxed competence of a man who'd built a small business on repeat customers and fair prices. And he'd hired Jack 3 years ago with nothing more than a handshake and a trial period that had become permanent after Eddie had watched him work with the kind of focus that couldn't be taught, only earned through repetition and necessity. The week since the fire had been strange in ways Jack hadn't anticipated, his routine interrupted by visitors who arrived with cameras and microphones, asking him to talk about what he'd done, to explain the moment of decision that had sent him running toward flames instead of away from them. He'd declined every interview, had developed a script that thanked them for their interest, but explained he preferred to keep to himself, had asked Eddie to tell anyone who called that Jack wasn't available for comment. But the attention had a momentum of its own. The boy's parents had shown up at the garage 2 days after the rescue, the mother crying and trying to hug him while he stood with his arms at his sides, unsure how to receive gratitude for something that had felt less like choice and more like reflex. They'd wanted to know his story, had asked questions about where he lived and where he was from, and Jack had given them minimal answers before making an excuse about a car waiting, retreating to the safety of work and the privacy of his own thoughts. What Jack hadn't told anyone, what he kept locked behind the careful walls he'd built during his time in prison, was that the moment of pulling the boy from the car had felt like redemption for something that had never been his fault to begin with. He'd spent 9 years surrounded by men who were guilty, who wore their crimes like badges of authenticity, in a place where weakness meant vulnerability and vulnerability meant survival, became much more complicated. Jack had maintained his innocence, had fought the conviction through 2 rounds of appeals that had gone nowhere, had finally accepted that the world had decided he was a violent criminal, regardless of what he knew to be true. Prison had taught him to keep his head down, to do his time without drawing attention, to cultivate a reputation for quiet competence that made him useful to both inmates and guards without making him a target. But it had also taught him that innocence was a luxury he could no longer afford to believe in, that the machinery of justice ground forward based on evidence and testimony regardless of truth, and that his life from that point forward would be divided into before and after, with no bridge between them. The parole hearing had been perfunctory, a panel of 3 people who'd reviewed his file and noted his clean disciplinary record and his completion of the anger management program that he'd been required to take, despite never having a history of violence before his conviction. They'd asked him if he took responsibility for his actions, and Jack had learned by then that denials only extended sentences, so he'd said what they needed to hear, that he regretted the harm he'd caused, that he'd used his time to reflect on his choices, that he was committed to being a productive member of society if given the opportunity. The words had tasted like ash, but they'd opened the door, and Jack had walked through it with the understanding that freedom came with conditions, and that his life would be monitored and constrained in ways that would never apply to people who hadn't been convicted of crimes they didn't commit. Eddie had hired him because he needed a mechanic and because he believed in second chances, and Jack had never corrected his assumption that Jack had earned the need for one. The bay door rattled open, and Eddie appeared with a clipboard, his reading glasses perched on his forehead, to tell Jack that someone from the district attorney's office had called asking to meet with him. Jack felt his stomach drop, the old fear that lived just beneath his surface suddenly awake and alert, because contact from the DA could only mean one thing: that someone had decided his parole conditions had been violated, that the careful life he'd built was about to be dismantled for reasons he wouldn't understand until it was too late. Eddie must have seen something in his face, because he quickly added that the woman, Laura Hayes, had emphasized this wasn't about his parole status, that she wanted to talk about the robbery case, about some questions that had come up during a review. Jack wiped his hands on a rag that was already stained beyond cleaning, his mind racing through possibilities while his face remained carefully neutral, and asked Eddie what he'd told her. Eddie said he'd given her Jack's phone number, figured it was Jack's choice whether to call her back, but that she'd seemed genuine, not like she was looking to jam him up, but like she actually wanted to help. Jack finished the oil change with hands that had started to shake, closed the bay door behind the customer's departing vehicle, and stood in the sudden quiet of the garage with Eddie's words echoing in his head. A district attorney wanting to help didn't match any version of reality Jack had learned to navigate, because prosecutors built cases and secured convictions and moved on to the next file without looking back at the lives they'd rearranged. But he also knew that refusing to meet would draw more attention than agreeing, that the appearance of cooperation was a survival skill he'd mastered long before his arrest and conviction. He pulled out the phone he kept in his locker, a basic model with no internet capability and a prepaid plan that couldn't be traced to anything except the number itself, and called the number Eddie had written on a piece of paper. Laura Hayes answered on the second ring, her voice professional but not cold, and asked if they could meet somewhere neutral, somewhere Jack would feel comfortable, to discuss some irregularities she'd found in his case file. Jack suggested the garage after hours, when Eddie would be gone, and they could talk without an audience, and she agreed without hesitation, said she could be there at 7 that evening if that worked for him. He spent the rest of the afternoon trying to focus on work, while his mind kept circling back to the question of what had changed. What had made someone from the DA's office decide to look at a case that had been closed for more than a decade? The only new variable was the fire, was the video that had gone viral, showing him pulling the boy from the burning car, and Jack felt a bitter irony in the possibility that the same act that had made strangers call him a hero might finally force the system to acknowledge it had made a mistake. But he also knew better than to hope, knew that hope was a liability that could be used against you, that the only safe approach was to expect nothing and be surprised by anything better. At 6:30, he locked the garage doors, turned on the overhead lights in the main bay, and waited for Laura Hayes to arrive with answers to questions he'd stopped asking years ago because no one had been interested in listening. The autumn evening settled over the industrial district with the particular quality of light that comes just before darkness fully takes hold, and Jack Miller stood among the tools of his trade, preparing to face the possibility that justice, which had failed him so completely, might finally be ready to admit its mistake. Laura Hayes arrived at the garage 7 minutes early, parking her sedan across the street and taking a moment to observe the building before crossing, a squat structure with corrugated siding and bay doors marked with years of scuffs and dents from vehicles backing in and out, the kind of business that served a neighborhood rather than chasing expansion. Through the window, she could see Jack Miller standing near a workbench, his posture suggesting vigilance rather than relaxation, and she felt a wave of nervousness that was unusual for someone who'd conducted hundreds of interviews with witnesses, defendants, and victims. This was different because she was no longer approaching as someone seeking to build a case, but as someone who needed to acknowledge that a case had been built wrongly. And the distinction changed everything about the power dynamic and the nature of the conversation she was about to have. She crossed the street as a light rain began to fall, knocked on the side door that Jack had left slightly ajar, and stepped inside when he called for her to enter. The garage smelled of motor oil and metal, that particular combination of industrial fluids and machinery that she associated with repair shops and gas stations, and Jack stood backlit by the fluorescent overheads with his arms crossed and his expression guarded. Laura introduced herself, shook his hand when he offered it with a grip that was firm but not challenging, and thanked him for agreeing to meet. She'd prepared a speech during the drive over, had organized her thoughts into a sequence that would explain without patronizing and acknowledge without making promises she couldn't keep. But standing in front of Jack Miller, with the evidence of her investigation sitting in the briefcase at her feet, the prepared words felt inadequate to the moment. She started instead with a question, asking him to tell her about the night of the robbery, not the version he'd told in court, but the truth as he remembered it, without worrying about whether it would sound believable or strategic. Jack's expression shifted from guarded to something approaching suspicion, and he asked her why she wanted to hear his story now, after 11 years, after he'd already served his time and been released and built a life that didn't include fighting battles he'd already lost. Laura took a breath, opened her briefcase, and pulled out the file she'd assembled. Patricia's findings about the evidence checkout, the financial records showing Raymond Carver's unexplained wealth, the timeline reconstruction that showed gaps in the prosecution's case that should have raised questions, but hadn't. She laid it all on the workbench between them, papers spreading like evidence of her own complicity, and told him the truth. That she believed he'd been framed, that someone with access and authority had planted evidence to ensure his conviction, and that she was committed to proving it regardless of how long it took or what professional consequences she faced. Jack looked at the papers without touching them, his face unreadable in the harsh light, and Laura watched him process information that would have been life-changing if delivered a decade earlier, but now came too late to undo the damage that had been done. He finally spoke, his voice flat and controlled, asking her what made her decide to look at his case again, what had changed to make a prosecutor suddenly care about whether justice had actually been served. Laura told him about the video of the rescue, about seeing his face and his actions, and feeling a dissonance that she couldn't ignore between the man who'd risked his life for a child and the man she'd helped send to prison for armed robbery and assault. She admitted that it had taken his heroism to make her look closely at evidence she should have questioned years ago, and she acknowledged that this said something troubling about how the system worked and about her own willingness to accept convenient narratives when they supported successful convictions. Jack listened without interruption, and when she finished, he asked the question she'd been dreading. Even if she proved he'd been framed, what did she expect him to do with that information now, after he'd already served the sentence and rebuilt his life with the understanding that the past couldn't be changed? Laura had an answer prepared. She could pursue wrongful conviction remedies that might result in monetary compensation, could work to have his record expunged so that the conviction wouldn't continue to limit his opportunities, could expose the corruption that had stolen 9 years of his freedom and ensure that whoever was responsible faced consequences. But as she listed these possibilities, she heard how hollow they sounded, how inadequate any remedy would be when measured against the years he'd spent in prison, the trauma of incarceration for a crime he didn't commit, the loss of time and possibility that could never be recovered, regardless of how much money or official acknowledgement was offered in exchange. Jack turned away from her, walked to the bay door, and stood looking out at the rain that had intensified into a steady downpour, the streetlights creating halos in the moisture that blurred the boundaries between light and dark. He told her, in a voice that carried more exhaustion than anger, that he'd stopped believing in justice somewhere around year 5 of his sentence, that he'd made peace with the fact that the world had decided he was guilty, and that no amount of protestation or evidence would change that fundamental verdict. He'd learned to survive by not hoping for things beyond his control, by focusing on the small autonomy available to him, what he ate, how he spent his commissary money, which groups he aligned himself with to avoid the worst of prison violence. And now she was standing in his garage telling him that it had all been a lie, that someone had deliberately destroyed his life for reasons he still didn't understand. And she expected him to care enough to help her investigate further, when investigation would only confirm what he'd always known, that he'd been innocent and it hadn't mattered. Laura moved to stand beside him at the bay door, not touching, but close enough that her presence was unavoidable, and told him that she understood his exhaustion, his cynicism, his complete lack of faith in a system that had ground him beneath its gears without remorse. She told him that she couldn't undo what had been done, couldn't give him back the years or erase the scars that 9 years in prison had left, couldn't make him whole in any meaningful sense of the word. But she also told him that she'd seen the video of him pulling that boy from the flames, had watched him choose to run toward danger when the easier choice would have been to walk away, and that choice suggested he still believed in something even if he'd convinced himself he didn't. She asked him to help her investigate, not because it would fix what was broken, but because there might be other Jack Millers out there, other men who'd been framed by the same people using the same methods, and exposing what had happened to him might prevent it from happening to someone else. Jack turned to look at her finally, his expression carrying a complexity of emotions that Laura couldn't fully pass. Anger and skepticism mixed with something that might have been hope, trying desperately not to show itself in case it was disappointed again. He asked her what she needed from him, what specific actions would constitute helping with her investigation, and Laura felt relief flood through her, because the question implied a willingness to engage, even if it was reluctant and hedged. She told him she needed him to recall everything he could about his arrest, about the search of his apartment, about the anonymous tip that had led police to his door. She needed him to think about whether there had been anyone in his life at that time who might have had reason to target him, anyone with connections to law enforcement or the criminal justice system, anyone who might have benefited from seeing him convicted. And she needed him to be patient while she built a case that would be strong enough to overcome the presumption that closed cases were correctly decided. They talked for another hour while rain hammered against the garage roof, Jack sharing details he'd tried to forget, the detective who'd seemed almost disinterested during the interrogation, as if the conclusion was foregone and the questions were merely procedural, the public defender who'd encouraged him to take a plea deal, even though he was innocent, because juries rarely acquitted when there was physical evidence. The moment when the guilty verdict was read and he'd felt something fundamental break inside him, the understanding that truth was subjective and power determined whose version prevailed. Laura took notes with hands that grew progressively more unsteady as the full weight of what had been done to this man became concrete rather than abstract. And by the time she left the garage, she carried not just information, but a sense of obligation that felt heavier than any case she'd worked in 15 years at the district attorney's office. She drove home, through streets washed clean by rain, her windshield wipers working overtime against the deluge, and made a decision that would define the remainder of her career. She would prove Jack Miller's innocence regardless of what it required, would tear down whatever walls protected the people responsible, and would accept whatever professional consequences came from challenging a system that valued closure over correctness. Justice might be slow and imperfect, but it was still the only tool they had for trying to set right what had been made wrong. The hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in late November, the courtroom half empty except for the parties directly involved, and a handful of reporters who'd gotten wind that something significant might be unfolding. Laura Hayes stood at the prosecution table with Patricia Chen beside her, both of them surrounded by boxes of evidence that represented 6 weeks of intensive investigation, financial records, witness statements, forensic re-examinations, and most damning of all, a recorded confession from Raymond Carver that Patricia had obtained through a combination of patience and strategic revelation of information that made it clear his options had narrowed to cooperation or prosecution. Jack Miller sat in the front row of the gallery, his posture rigid with the kind of tension that comes from not allowing yourself to hope while circumstances suggest you should, his eyes fixed on the judge, who would decide whether 11 years of injustice would be officially acknowledged or whether the system's need for finality would prevail over its commitment to truth. Judge Margaret Santos had a reputation for intellectual rigor and impatience with legal gamesmanship, and she'd spent the previous afternoon reviewing the motion for post-conviction relief that Laura had filed along with the supporting documentation. She began the hearing by summarizing the allegations that physical evidence had been planted by a police detective with motivation provided by payment from an individual who'd wanted Jack Miller removed from society for reasons that had nothing to do with the robbery he'd been convicted of committing. The original crime had occurred, Santos noted, but the perpetrator had never been Jack Miller, and the detective who'd investigated the case had accepted money to ensure that Miller took the fall, while the actual robber walked free. It was, the judge said with a tone that conveyed both sadness and anger, a systematic betrayal of every principle that the criminal justice system claimed to uphold. Laura presented the evidence methodically, walking the judge through the timeline of Raymond Carver's financial windfall that had begun within months of Miller's conviction, showing bank transfers that traced back through 2 layers of corporate shells to an account belonging to Marcus Chen, the actual perpetrator of the robbery, who happened to be the nephew of a city councilman with both the resources and motivation to protect his family from scandal. Marcus Chen had beaten the convenience store clerk during a robbery gone wrong, had panicked and called his uncle, and the uncle had reached out to Carver with a proposition: find someone else to take the fall, make the evidence stick, and receive compensation substantial enough to secure early retirement. Carver had chosen Jack Miller almost at random, a man who'd been in the area, who had no alibi that couldn't be questioned, who was employed but not successful enough to afford expensive legal representation, who would be believed as a criminal because he existed in that grey space of working-class invisibility that made him both sympathetic and expendable. The recorded confession played in the silent courtroom, Carver's voice describing the process of planting the weapon in Miller's apartment, of coaching the victim to identify Miller from a lineup, of checking out the evidence before trial to ensure that any potential complications were addressed. He'd been careful, he said, because the stakes were high and because he'd known that if the frame fell apart, he'd face charges that would strip him of his pension and his freedom. But Patricia had shown him evidence of his financial transactions, had made it clear that federal agencies were interested in the pattern of payments that suggested ongoing corruption beyond just the Miller case. And Carver had made the calculation that cooperation might buy him leniency, while continued denial would only delay the inevitable. His voice on the recording was matter-of-fact, almost casual. describing the destruction of Jack Miller's life with the same tone someone might use to explain a routine work process, and Laura watched the judge's face harden as she listened. The defense attorney representing the district attorney's office, because even in acknowledging error, institutions protected themselves through procedure, made a brief argument that the motion should be granted, that Jack Miller had been wrongfully convicted based on fabricated evidence, and that the interests of justice required immediate remedy. It was a peculiar choreography, prosecution and defense aligned for once in seeking the same outcome, and Judge Santos nodded along before asking if anyone wished to present argument against granting relief. The silence that followed was broken only by the heating system cycling on and the rustle of papers as the court reporter adjusted her position. Santos let the silence extend until it became uncomfortable, until everyone understood that she was making a point about the absence of any legitimate reason to allow an innocent man's conviction to stand, before finally speaking in a voice that carried both authority and controlled fury. She granted the motion for post-conviction relief, declared Jack Miller's conviction void, and ordered his immediate release from parole supervision, and then she did something unusual. She spoke directly to Jack, acknowledging that no words or legal remedies could restore what had been taken from him, but that the state of Colorado recognized its failure and would not compound that failure by offering inadequate compensation or bureaucratic obstacles to his exoneration. She ordered the district attorney's office to work with Jack's newly appointed attorney to ensure he received the maximum compensation available under state law for wrongful incarceration, approximately $50,000 per year served, and she recommended that the state legislature consider increasing those caps given the magnitude of harm caused by erroneous convictions. She also ordered a full review of every case Raymond Carver had worked during his tenure to determine if there were other victims of his corruption who deserved similar relief. The courtroom stirred as the judge's words concluded, reporters moving toward the doors to file stories, the defense attorney gathering papers with the relieved expression of someone who'd successfully navigated a minefield of potential liability. Laura remained at the prosecution table until the room had largely emptied, then walked to where Jack still sat, his face showing nothing despite the enormity of what had just occurred. She sat beside him without asking permission, and they stayed there in silence while the bailiff began turning off lights and the court reporter packed up her equipment. Two people who'd been adversaries without knowing it, and who were now connected by the shared experience of witnessing justice, arrived too late and too inadequately to undo the harm it was meant to remedy. Jack finally spoke, his voice quiet enough that Laura had to lean closer to hear, asking her what happened next, what his life looked like now that he was officially innocent rather than just released. Laura told him that the conviction would be expunged from his record, that he'd receive financial compensation, that while substantial couldn't be considered adequate, that he could pursue civil remedies against the city and the individuals involved if he chose. But more importantly, she told him, he would have his name back, his reputation, the ability to move through the world without the weight of a violent felony conviction constraining every opportunity and interaction. It wasn't enough, she acknowledged, but it was something. And sometimes something was all the system could offer when asked to repair damage it had caused through incompetence or malice. They walked out of the courthouse together into a November afternoon that was clear and cold, the kind of weather that promised snow before evening. Reporters waited on the steps with cameras and questions, but Jack walked past them without stopping, his face set in the neutral expression he'd perfected over years of declining attention. Laura paused long enough to make a brief statement, acknowledging the wrongful conviction, promising a full investigation into systemic failures that had allowed it to occur, and committing herself to ensuring that reforms were implemented to prevent future injustices. The words felt both necessary and insufficient, performative in a way that troubled her, even as she recognized their importance for maintaining public confidence in institutions that had just been shown to be profoundly fallible. Later that evening, as Laura sat in her office reviewing the case files she'd need to prepare for the investigation into Carver's other cases, her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. She opened it to find a short note from Jack, thanking her for believing him when no one else had, for pursuing truth even when it meant acknowledging systemic failure, for treating him like a person rather than a case number. He ended by saying that he was still angry, still damaged by what had been done to him, but that knowing the truth had been recognized and acknowledged helped in ways he hadn't expected. Laura read the message twice before responding with her own brief note, saying that she'd done only what justice required, even if it had taken far too long, and that she hoped he'd find some measure of peace in whatever life he built from here. The Denver skyline glittered beyond her window, indifferent to the small drama of correction that had played out in a courtroom 8 floors below street level, and Laura Hayes sat in the gathering darkness thinking about systems and individuals, about the ways that well-intentioned structures could be corrupted by malicious actors, about the particular kind of courage it took to acknowledge error when acknowledgement came with professional and political costs. Jack Miller had pulled a boy from fire without hesitation, had chosen heroism when self-preservation would have been easier, and in doing so had set in motion a chain of events that had finally forced justice to confront its own failures. The truth had been reclaimed, late but not too late, imperfectly but not inadequately, and that small victory against the entropy of injustice would have to be enough. Because in the end, Laura understood, justice wasn't a destination, but a practice, a daily commitment to getting it right, even when getting it right meant admitting you'd gotten it wrong, and the only way forward was through honesty about the past. However painful that honesty might be,